Some 200 US Marines landed in northern Australia this week as part of a broader strategic shift by the US military toward the Pacific. Is this a response or threat to China's growing dominance in a region vital to US economic interests? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The first of that new contingent of US Marines were welcomed to Darwin, Northern Australia this week. The force will eventually expand to 2,500, who at least officially will train with Australian troops and assist in humanitarian efforts in the Asia-Pacific.
The United States is a Pacific power, and we are here to stay.
The deployment is part of a wider shift in US foreign policy announced by President Obama in November during a speech to the Australian Parliament. But their deployment is being widely interpreted as a bid to counterbalance China's growing military and economic might in the region and its increasing assertiveness in territorial disputes in the South China Sea. The strategic shift in US foreign policy appears to have reassured some Asian countries, at least according to official statements, even as many of those same nations look to China for their own economic growth. All this comes at a time when there's tremendous pressure on the US defense budget and the total number of US troops is being cut. Let's listen to what the US Defense Secretary Leon Panetta said in January when talking about the future military strategy with a smaller force.
We are also rebalancing our global posture and presence, emphasizing the Pacific and the Middle East. These are the areas where we see the greatest challenges for the future. The U.S. military will increase its institutional weight and focus on enhanced presence, power projection, and deterrence in Asia-Pacific. This region is growing in importance to the future of the United States in terms of our economy and our national security. This means, for instance, improving capabilities that maintain our military's technological edge and freedom of action.
So what is the US trying to achieve with its deployment of troops to Australia, and is China right to have concerns about it? Joining me to discuss this, Barry Pavel. He's from the International Security Program at the Atlantic Council. He's also a former National Security Council official, serving both President George W. Bush and President Obama. And in that role, he was a key contributor to President Obama's 2010 National Security Strategy. In New York, we have Gordon Chang, a political analyst and the author of the book The Coming Collapse of China. And in the studio, Hilary Mann Leverett, a former White House official and former State Department official. She's currently a visiting scholar at Peking University in China. Barry Pavel, then, we saw Leon Panetta outlining some of the strategy there. He talks also about power projection, deterrence, and so forth. Since you helped draw up this national security strategy, what is the US so frightened about? On whom is the power being projected? Against whom is this deterrence being projected?
Sure, and just to be clear, I didn't help draw up this particular strategic shift, but I did help with previous Obama administration strategy documents. I think in many ways this is a return to a previous US strategy. I was writing some of the strategy in 2001 in the Pentagon when it was attacked on 9/11. And those strategy documents were looking to shift towards Asia, recognizing the very long-term trends in political and economic and other forms of power that are shifting to Asia in what may be perhaps the most rapid shift of power in history. And so I think in many ways this is just a rebalancing of the U.S. posture that is a return after the long 10 years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I also think that the shift is rhetorical and it's important, but it's not going to happen because I think the Middle East will intervene. And while we will have some Marines in Australia and a few other things, I think events in the Middle East will continue to demand the U.S. military activities.
Chuck, can I just point, that's a very interesting time marker that Barry has put on the table, the pre-9/11, pre-2001 strategic culture and thinking in the United States. Because certainly the view in China, not by everyone, but by a lot of people, strategic thinkers in China, is that that is where the United States was going pre-9/11, was to look back to Asia, try to reclaim hegemony in Asia, but for the 9/11 attacks, which drew us into the Middle East. In China, the thinking was that that would give China about 20 years to focus on its internal domestic growth and its political stability. They thought they had a good 20 years. They're now seeing that that timeline that they thought they had to focus on domestic cohesion and stability has been cut short by this American pivot away from trying to pursue its hegemony in the Middle East back to Asia.
When President Obama presented it, though, he did suggest there wasn't any need for any undue concern in Beijing. This is how President Obama discussed the pivot when he was, just recently.
Meanwhile, the United States will continue our effort to build a cooperative relationship with China. All of our nations, Australia, the United States, all of our nations have a profound interest in the rise of a peaceful and prosperous China. That's why the United States welcomes it. We've seen that China can be a partner, from reducing tensions on the Korean Peninsula to preventing proliferation. And we'll seek more opportunities for cooperation with Beijing, including greater communication between our militaries to promote understanding and avoid miscalculation. We will do this even as we continue to speak candidly to Beijing about the importance of upholding international norms and respecting the universal human rights of the Chinese people.
Gordon Chang, is that how you see it then? I mean, it's sort of like there's nothing to worry about. I mean, this is just simply a matter of how things work. We're a Pacific nation as well. We just want to all live in harmony. But of course, we do have some issues. But that's secondary to us simply having a presence.
That's the China that President Obama wants to see. That's the China that President Obama really tried to work towards in the initial months of his administration. But what's happened is that because of Beijing being more assertive and being even hostile on occasion, it has troubled countries in the neighborhood, and they've turned to the United States for leadership. And so what we have seen is what people call the pivot. I don't think the administration wanted to pivot, but they had to do so because countries like Australia and Vietnam, South Korea, Japan have really asked for American leadership in the region. So if there's been a pivot, it's because of China, not because of what the United States wanted to do.
And this is the narrative we hear in Washington. So it's not simply then business as usual before we were rudely interrupted by Afghanistan and Iraq. This is due to specific circumstances, what's talked about in D.C. at least as Chinese aggression.
Yes, and I think that there's certainly a lot of evidence of that, especially in the South China Sea. This is something that has concerned countries in the region. President Obama really wanted to work with the Chinese. February 2009, Secretary of State Clinton said that they were going to sort of drop human rights and try to, because there were other more important issues to talk to the Chinese. And that was seen as a sort of an outreach attempt, but the Chinese viewed it as sort of a sign of weakness, a signal of weakness, and actually tried to pursue the United States in ways that made Washington uncomfortable, and it made countries in the region uncomfortable.
But I mean, Hillary Mann Leverett, is it aggressive, or is it China acting out of turn if it does start forging new relationships both with other Asian powers, with powers in Latin America, with powers in the Middle East and so forth? Because clearly that's how it is all being viewed here.
Yes, and for China, this is perfectly normal. China is pursuing normal relations with neighbors in its region. It's pursuing normal international trade relations with countries all around the world, that this is normal. The concern China has is that the Obama administration is walking back from what they see the core bargain that it struck with Nixon and Kissinger with the opening of China. That core bargain being that essentially the United States would stop pursuing hegemony in Asia and essentially share hegemony with the People's Republic of China in Asia. They see the Obama administration as specifically walking back from that core bargain, so that you had in November Secretary Clinton write an article in Foreign Policy magazine where she avowed that the United States was not just going to send troops to Asia, but that we were going to send our development experts, our officials, probably including CIA officers and a lot of other people that make the Chinese nervous, not just to one or two countries. We were going to send them, quote unquote, to every country and every corner of the Asia-Pacific region, every corner. How would America Americans feel if the Chinese sent all of their officials to every corner of the Americas. There's a reason why the Chinese are concerned about this. They see it as walking back on the basic bargain for the U.S.-China rapprochement.
This seems like a good point for a map. Let's take a look at where Darwin is then and how strategic it is in the region. I mean, it's called a Pacific pivot, but in some ways, you could call it maybe a pivot from the northern Pacific to the southern Pacific in some ways. But yeah, so you can see Darwin down there at the bottom of your screen at that rather key position between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, the South China Sea in the middle. And there is this sense that the US has been trying to form some kind of semicircular bloc stretching from India and other South Asian countries, then going around there, the Indonesia and the archipelago over there, then moving back up all the way up to Japan. And clearly, from a Chinese point of view, wouldn't that look a bit like encirclement, Barry Pavel?
I don't think so. Look, China's a big power. Let's take a look at this map. You can go anywhere in the Pacific, anywhere across Eurasia, and you're kind of near China. I don't agree with Hillary. I don't think this is a bid for hegemony. The U.S. is a Pacific power. The U.S. will always be a Pacific power. The story of the 20th century was transatlantic relations, because that's where the locus of economic activity largely was, and that's where a lot of security issues arose. The story of the 21st century will be trans-Pacific relations. And so just because the U.S. is renewing its military presence...
But not just renewing its military presence, but forging new military alliances, flooding the entire region with new hardware.
Alliances. Name one new alliance.
Well, India, I suppose, but enhancing its presence in Australia with B-52 bombers and everything else, more missile defense capabilities and so forth. I mean, is that really simply a very benign move?
So here's where we get into the question of capabilities versus intentions. China's military is growing rapidly. China's investing double-digit percentages in its military, growing every year. China is going to be, soon, the global economic power within the next 10, 15 years.
Is that a threat?
So it's not a threat. And I have talked to senior administration officials here, senior statesmen here, and no one wants a war with China. We need to cooperate with China. There are so many problems we should work on together, ranging from climate change to North Korea. Lots of problems.
Right,
but we do see China's military, and I think the criticism that the pivot so far has been over-militarized, I might buy that in terms of the rhetoric. But I think the question of the U.S. engaging in the Pacific with China and with all other countries and welcoming Chinese engagement and soft power with all other countries, fine. I think the question that I want to get to is we need to make sure our militaries, the U.S. military and the Chinese military, don't create a dynamic that leads to crisis unnecessarily.
Right. And the argument is this is precisely what's happening.
That is precisely what the
careful.
Chinese see is happening. The Chinese see that unlike any other country in the world, perhaps except the Islamic Republic of Iran, no other country is as surrounded and has the U.S. military literally at their doorsteps doing exercises and patrols at their doorstep. No other country, not even Russia, has that kind of U.S. military presence right in their face. But also, if you look back, and Barry points to the 20th century being the century of European cooperation, for the Chinese, it was also a century where the United States interfered in what they call a ferocious way in Asia that led to essentially two proxy wars with China in Korea, in Vietnam, that led to, by our own count, at least 400,000 Chinese dead. That's a history and a record that the Chinese see as current and something they need to continue to guard against. So while we may see this as something natural, of course we're Pacific power, their perception of our being, of course, a Pacific power is not one that was a peaceful, stabilizing relationship.
Gordon Chang, I mean, there does seem to be that disconnect in the rhetoric that we hear from Washington about switching from, hot wars and so forth to just focusing on diplomacy and reducing military spending and so forth. When Leon Panetta talks about power projection, particularly for China, when you looked at that map, I mean, clearly China depends on its sea lanes for its exports, it depends on its sea lanes for its oil and gas. Isn't the US simply projecting its power on all of China's lifelines there?
Well, it certainly is, and we should be explaining to the Chinese why we're doing that. The problem, the Chinese do have a good argument that we are not being candid with them about what's going on, but we are really pivoting to Asia because of of conduct that is unacceptable. You know, Hillary talks about the Korean War. Well, that was basically China and North Korea attacking the South. Also, but we've seen more recently, China harassing American vessels in international waters, the Chinese harassing the Japanese in Japanese waters, the South Koreans in South Korean waters, all the problems in Vietnam. You know, countries around the region have really turned to the U.S. not because they really wanted to. And we got to remember that in 2007, 2008, basically the United States was leaving Asia. All these countries were turning towards China. They were maybe a little bit concerned, but nonetheless, China had really won. And now the landscape is so different, not because of what the U.S. did, but because of what Beijing did.
So that's the narrative we're hearing, Hillary. That we didn't want to come back in. But we have to come in, and the people and ASEAN and Asia want us.
And we hear a similar narrative in the Middle East. It's not that we really want to be there. It's the Israelis need us to be there. We have to be there to defend our allies like the Israelis or even the Saudis. We have to go in to defend these allies. There's never any focus here in Washington on what those allies do to contribute to instability in the region, what their policies are. And there's no commitment from the United States to deal with the major powers, whether they're in the Middle East or in Asia, in an atmosphere of mutual respect where we are completely committed to resolving disputes peacefully and through internationally recognized mechanisms.
Pavel, there is that suspicion that this is partly a reaction, not necessarily to any imminent threat from China, but actually a bit of confusion, or maybe sort of a sense of autopilot amongst the defense and establishment in Washington. You know, the hot wars are over. Well, perhaps we do need a Cold War now, partly to justify our own existence and continued expenditure. But you know, just because that's what we do, and there's always a logic of looking at that instead of looking at in a much larger way at perhaps creating a new world order, the new world order we were always promised after the end of the Cold War. That's just never going to happen because it's just the programming hasn't been done on the minds in Washington to get there.
I think we should distinguish between tactical causes and moves and strategic. And I'm not clear that I agree completely with what Dr. Chang said. I think the U.S. would have gone back and increased its presence in Asia regardless of China overplaying its hand. The China overplaying its hand certainly made that more welcoming among U.S. friends and allies in the region, might have made it a more rapid sort of shift. But the U.S., as I said, in 2001 was already planning to emphasize Asia in terms of engagement, not in terms of being provocative. But
really, I mean, wasn't there much excitement about the air-sea battle concept as opposed to the air-land concept against the Soviets? Now we have the air-sea battle concept.
So this is where I'm trying to get into tactical and operational versus strategic. And so as a military planner, if you're sitting in the Pentagon, it takes a long time to get this equipment. So if you're looking out 20 years, you don't know who the head of China is going to be. You don't know if the President of the United States in 2025 is going to call on you, and you better have capabilities ready. And so the Chinese planners are saying the same thing. We don't know what the U.S. is going to do in 2020, 2025. Right. It takes us a long time.
But we know
we have to have capabilities ready.
But we know some basic things about international relations and power relations and how they interact. And our experience with China for over 150 years, like our experience with the Islamic Republic of Iran, is that those two countries don't invade their neighbors. They've actually had invaders that invade them. They've both been the targets of other Western and other powers from outside of the region invading them.
Iran's so there's some aggressive? Iran doesn't
what country has the Islamic Republic of Iran invaded? Okay. They've never invaded another country. But the perception, the mentality here is that they are aggressive by their nature, by their very nature, they're aggressive.
And this is all about perceptions. And what was so fascinating was, I think it was last month, an amazing document was published from the Brookings Institution, which purports to give us a sense of what the Chinese leadership, or how they do view the U.S. leadership. It was called Addressing U.S.-China Strategic Distrust. And the general gist was that China knows that the U.S. is in decline, but it continues to blunder in the Middle East and so forth. But even in decline, the U.S. still feels this need to project hegemonic power with all its spying. So here's an extract then that's already on your screen. It's strongly believed in China that the ultimate goal of the United States in world affairs is to maintain its hegemony and dominance. As a result, Washington will attempt to prevent the emerging powers, in particular China, from achieving their goals and enhancing their stature. This projection is being seen is being seen as an aggressive act on the part of the U.S. There's more here. While the American concern may lead to increased suspicions that China already has an ambition to beat the U.S., the Chinese optimism has also engendered apprehension that the U.S. will do whatever it can to obstruct China's march toward becoming an economic, political, and military giant. There's that fear that in attempting to perhaps come to the aid of other powers in the region, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy then of aggression and battle. And in fact, one of the authors said last month that his fear was that the US and China will become antagonists in the next 15 years because of the strategic mistrust between the two powers, Gordon Chang.
Well, you know, there's got to be mistrust because China claims the entire South China Sea is its own, which basically means the continental shelves of 6 other nations. It wants to absorb Taiwan. It wants islands that are under the administration of Japan and which basically the rest of the world recognizes as Japanese. They now want a set of islands that the South Koreans control. They want parts of Indian control, Tibet. And, you know, essentially what you have is a country that has been talking about taking Okinawa. So, you know, yes, of course there are strategic miscalculations possible, but because of what China is doing, I think it's important for the United States to say these disputes need to be settled peacefully, and we will not tolerate aggressive actions on the part of Chinese. That's important to keep the peace, and that's what countries in the region want.
Is that your sense of China then? That its increased power has led to an expansionist impulse amongst the government and the military?
Well, we've seen no evidence of that. And essentially, China is not an expansionist country. There is no evidence of that in the historical record. They may be acting more or less aggressively than they were 10 years ago, but these are about basic territorial disputes. The Chinese don't go out to other countries and invade other countries to make those people more like China, to impose China's system, their military system, their political system, or their economic system. They don't do that. But they see the United States as doing precisely that, the United States and Europe, that we go out to other countries with military force to try to make other peoples and other societies just like us. They see that as an inherent difference and a huge problem. They are not an expansionist power. They are largely a defensive one. We are not, and that's an inevitable clash in the international system.
Gordon Chang.
Hillary, how about Korea? How about Mischief Reef? How about all the islands in Vietnam? How about 1979 invasion of Vietnam? This is not a peaceful country, and it's getting worse, especially with the way the Chinese have been talking. Early part of 2010, Chinese generals and senior colonels have been talking about waging war on the United States within 5 to 10 years' time. And these generals are not being demoted or punished. What's going on here,
No
Hillary?
country is peaceful. That's not reality.
Isn't that what generals do? Isn't the US actually planning similar contingencies against China?
Contingencies because of what the Chinese have been saying, but you don't see generals and admirals in Washington saying we're going to nuke Beijing. But you do hear Chinese generals say the same thing, and they've said that consistently.
Look, no country is peaceful. Every country, every power, every existing great power or aspiring great power tries to get as much power as they can. Some do it by building their own capacities, and they may be somewhat aggressive in defending their territory. Other countries, other powers try to do it in an expansionist way, in a way to make others be like them. That is the inherent clash, and as long as you have that and you walk back from the bargain that Nixon and Kissinger struck with China, where we said we would step back from that. We would let China, for all we don't like about China, and there's a lot not to like about China, their military, their politics, their economics, a lot not to like. But we decided the bargain was we would let them be. And the Obama administration has steadily walked that back, and that's why China's so worried.
Pavel, at the root, though, isn't there this fundamental question about what is aggressive meddling and what is guaranteeing peace and stability? And isn't there always a problem in Washington, perhaps, ever to think that the US is ever doing anything but guaranteeing peace and stability when it's seen elsewhere in the world as aggressive meddling?
If you can point to one action since the pivot's been announced that's aggressive and meddling, then I'd be happy to entertain that. I think what we have here is a return of the U.S. military as a stabilizing presence. And no serious strategic thinker in this administration or advising this administration wants a war with China. It would be disastrous. Our economies are intertwined.
What people want, but what can happen as a result of a series of...
So we need serious civilian control.
Nobody wanted Vietnam.
We need civilian control over our military here. I think we have it pretty well. I would like more civilian control in China. There have been several instances of Chinese military actions that the foreign ministry wasn't aware of and that the president of China wasn't aware of. The ASAT test, other Chinese military actions, so it's in our interests to work with China to strengthen their civilian control of the military so we can avoid these types of miscalculations and instability.
But wouldn't that be meddling in Chinese internal affairs? I mean, even the way that you frame that...
I'm not saying we're going to do it. I'm
right.
saying it is in our interest. It's in all of our interests for the militaries not to miscalculate, not to overstep, and to work with each other to help solve common problems. There's enough problems to deal with without fomenting conflict.
But I mean, there was that conclusion of that Brookings report. Insiders from both China and Washington saying they fear, at least they said after they released the report, in 15 years, the US and China could be antagonists. Does that look likely on the path that we're on, Hillary, very quickly?
If we keep going to China's doorstep, the problem for militaries miscalculating is that we're in China's face. We're on their doorstep. The problem isn't a miscalculation here off the Atlantic, or, off California or off New York. You don't have Chinese submarines there, Chinese warplanes patrolling our coasts. That's not the concern about the miscalculation. The miscalculation is real about our encirclement of China.
But we also don't have neighbors in our immediate area that are nervous about us invading them or coercing them. And we do have neighbors who are allies of the United States in the Pacific, neighbors of China who have been nervous because China overplayed its hand.
Which is exactly what the Israelis and the Saudis say to justify our intervention of hundreds of thousands of troops into the Middle East.
There are patterns emerging. Barry Pavel, thank you. Hillary Mann, Leverett, Gordon Chang, thank you very much in New York. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. We want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.